Today we have Adam B. Coleman, author of The Children We Left Behind, which comes out April 1st, I believe, right?
Correct.
Okay, right on. And has a couple other books and does a lot of stuff. He's the founder of Wrong Speak Pub, at Wrong Speak Pub, ambassador for XXXY Athletics. Um, you publish stuff in New York Post and stuff like that as well, right? I believe.
Hmm.
So pretty well known, I would imagine at this point. Um, you can follow him on X at wrong_speak. Adam, do you want to tell us a little bit why you wrote or why you chose to write the book, The Children We Left Behind?
Sure. Um, the primary reason I started writing it was because um, it's much of my personal story as a child. I grew up without my father, and I understand what it looks like to question your identity, to struggle with um, low self esteem and things of that nature, trying to figure out who you are. Um, but especially because, I first wrote Black Victim and Black Victor. That was the first thing I did publicly. I wrote the book first and then I, tried to promote it. And then everything else just kind of came from it. But whenever I would write publicly about um, the importance of family and things of that nature, or if there was some sort of news event and I was pointing out the family dynamic, I would get such a big response because there were a lot of people, one, who agreed with me, but two, who were going through something similar to what I'm criticizing or know someone who's going through that. Um, and I just realized over time, like, this is like I knew, but it's one thing to hear it over and over from random people of all ranges, all age ranges, all ethnicities. Most of the people don't look like me. And they're saying, like, that's my story. That's my friend's story. That's my dad's story. Like, it's just everyone around them. Every person that I've had this conversation with knows someone who's dealing with family separation, whether it's currently or in the past, and they struggled with it. But it's all around us in the United States. And I was like, this is the biggest thing that's affecting our society that we don't talk enough about. We don't talk about it with a very fine point. And sometimes it becomes like a loose thing, fatherless behavior, and just people just throw it out there and just kind of leave it as a jab, as if that child had something to do with their father not being there. Um, and so what I wanted to do was to use my story as an example. It's not a memoir, but there are lots of stories within the book filled with examples where I struggled. And if I struggled with this, imagine how many other kids are struggling with this. I'm breaking down certain concepts of areas where I did struggle and what my mindset was. I'm giving a view of a child who was left behind so people can understand what I went through. And often they'll see, like, well, you look fine today, but they don't understand the decades of struggle, the decades of depression, um, suicidal ideation, all of these different things that a lot of kids are struggling with finding God in their life because they feel abandoned and they even feel abandoned spiritually. And I talk a bit about that within the book too. So it's a very complex, multi-layered um, problem. But at the forefront of the book, I'm pointing my finger at the selfish adults in these children's lives. Because at the end of the day, the kids are the ones being left behind by the adults. The kids have to basically get dragged along to all the decisions that the adults are making in their lives. And they have no say as to what happens. And the problem is that our culture has shifted to where whatever the adults want, right, as long as they're not breaking any laws, right, whatever the adults want is okay. So if mom or dad is no longer happy and wants to blow up the family, it's okay because mommy and daddy deserve to be happy. And so Forget reconciling, forget trying to resolve an issue, forget humility, saying I'm sorry, trying to find common ground because there's something more important than themselves. It is blow up the family. The kids will be fine. Maybe we'll throw them into some therapy. And they don't realize that the wound that they're creating is lifelong and that it is a struggle to realize that even though my parents abandoned me, it doesn't mean that everyone else will. And it's that fear that is hard for them to get over. So I wanted to use this book to, one, highlight the irreverent behavior coming from the adults in our society, but also to give a face to the child that is being disregarded, that is being abandoned. And I'm using my childhood story to accentuate that.
You're not saying in, a general sense that no divorce should happen, right? I mean, obviously there are some cases. Do you think it's better to try to work out a toxic situation for the kid, or do you think maybe divorce in that situation would be best? Or do you really have, I mean, probably hard to say case by case if I imagine.
Well, the one thing I would say is I've never met someone who got a divorce who didn't think they deserved to have a divorce, right? Every
Right.
person thinks that, well, divorce is bad. Yes, I get it. But my situation was different.
Right on.
And so when I hear that, and then if you listen long enough, you're like, that was the disagreement, right? It's not that there was physical abuse or emotional abuse or something of that nature. It's financial reasons, right? And as someone who's been poor, you're not always poor forever. You know, some financial situations are temporary. You can stick this one out. You can support the person. Like, why did you duck and run so quickly? Like, there are a multitude of reasons, but we know that divorce, number one reason is our finances. That's like the breaking point for that relationship. But like there are a lot of small petty disagreements that build up and just turn a relationship sour because one or both parties are unwilling to compromise, to say they're sorry, to understand the other person's perspective. And in some cases, just repeating the same type of behavior that they saw when they grew up, um, which was unhealthy. And they're just perpetuating the cycle, and their kids are seeing the same type of thing. And so, yes, I'm in agreement with divorce under very particular circumstances where, yes, I think it's worse for your kids to see you being physically abused than it is for you to get divorced, right? And obviously, that is a safety issue. Um, but for the other situations where people are getting divorced, a lot of it is just pride. A lot of it is um, they want to feel something special, or they were running off of butterflies and those butterflies aren't there anymore. And they feel quote unquote bored, or they feel that like it's a these are feelings, these are emotions, and these things can be worked out, can be discussed. But I would even go as far, and I talk about this a little bit in the book. I think part of the problem is that we're trying to band-aid the issue later on when the original issue starts before children are even born. Um, the I go as far as saying that if you wouldn't marry someone, you probably shouldn't have sex with them, right? Because there's a possibility that that person can get pregnant. If you're a guy, that woman can get pregnant, or that man who impregnated you will be the father of your kids. Do you want that guy to be the father of your kids? And these are real questions that you have to ask yourself. And then you have to ask yourself, all right, if the answer is yes, why? What about them makes you believe that they would be a suitable father? And if they'd be a suitable father, then why wouldn't you marry that person? See, these are logical questions. And the problem that I'm seeing is that we don't ask questions as adults. And I'm including myself, I'm a product of how I grew up, and marriage wasn't something that was discussed in my household. So when I started becoming sexually active and I liked my son's mother, and I tried to make it work, but I didn't know what I was looking for, right? I didn't know what qualities I was wanting. I wasn't I believed I wanted to get married, but I didn't know if she was the right person. And I sure wasn't thinking marriage when I first started having sex with her, right? I wasn't raised to understand the order of success. And so I had a child out of wedlock. And ultimately, we did not get married with each other. She ended up getting married to somebody else some years later. But I understand today, as a man who has grown and understood that I did things out of order. And the last thing I want to do is tell my son to do it like how I did it. And so my son's 19 now. And I've made sure that he understands, especially when he started dating, like, you do this in a particular order and you do it, and you have to be very conscious of it, right? Why do you want to be with that girl? Ask yourself this question. What about her is important to you? Why do you like her? Is this healthy? Um, and these are things that I've noticed that a lot of people don't ask themselves prior to getting into relationships with people. It is very emotional and whimsical. And love is that. I get that. Now, I'm not saying you should remove all love and all emotion from it, but with love and emotion should come some thoughtfulness, right? Some mindfulness and asking these questions, right? Because my heart can be deceitful, right? And so we need to ask ourselves these questions to make us think, to see if our heart is in line with our minds. And so I'm trying to have the conversation as far as, how do we approach family planning? Because the problem comes into play where we just start having sex with people, and maybe we just get married to them because we've just been having sex for a long time. And they seem to like me and I seem to like them. But they got red flags all over the place, but it's too late. Now they made it baby with them. And now you made a second baby with them. And then you're getting a divorce. Why? Because of all the original issues this person had that you had glossed over because you were consistently having sex and that's how you resolved issues. Right. And now you're here. Now she wants to take your kids away from you. Like, so it's like, but you didn't think about her being that potential mother. You just thought she was hot and you wanted to have sex with her, right? So
Right.
this is the trap. This is the trap of chasing that feeling, chasing the woman, chasing this. And even from the female's perspective, chasing the guy who makes you feel this way. But like, any guy can make you feel a particular way, but does that make him a suitable father? And then you have to start looking at the quality of that man. Does he have the qualities to be a good father? Then you have to ask yourself, what is a good father? Right? So when you start asking these questions, then you'll come up with the answer. And if that man is not a good father, he doesn't have the qualities to be one, you should not procreate with him. And if you wouldn't procreate with him, you wouldn't marry him either. Right? So to me, it's very logical, but these are things you have to think of prior to getting caught up in emotions. And these are things that I had to learn through bad relationships where thankfully I did not have children with these women, but these are bad relationships that these things could have happened. And I could have gotten caught up having multiple children with multiple baby mamas and all this other stuff because I just was not thinking. I was repeating bad behavior, not bad behavior, but just like illogical behavior, chasing emotions, chasing acceptance, right? Will she like me? Just chasing and chasing, but I wasn't thinking. And it was because I didn't think highly of myself to discriminate. I just accepted the first person who would finally accept me. And that's a huge trap for any insecure person.
Your book, I'm assuming, is geared more towards the parents than the kids. Uh, would that be fair to say?
I would say that if we're talking strictly age range,
Yeah.
I think a high school kid can read it, and I think it would be okay, right? Because just there are some things like I do talk about sexual abuse within it, right? And I think high schoolers of a certain age can understand that and it not be too polarizing for them.
Right on.
But I am definitely talking to someone else who is like me, who was abandoned, who is struggling. So they realize they're not alone in their struggle. I'm also writing to the parent, whether they're a good parent or a bad parent, but the parent, have them understand that you have way more power than you realize, and that your choices are far more significant than you realize. And I think that the parents believe that I'm making a choice for me when really they're making a choice for their entire family. And and then we lie to ourselves saying if I'm happy, they'll be happy. And that's not how kids work, right? If you're happy, it's irrelevant to if your child will actually be happy either. And sometimes the adults think that the children understand relationship dynamics when they really don't, right? So if mommy and daddy have been together for 5 years and then they get a divorce when you're at the age of 5, that 5-year-old doesn't understand why mommy and daddy no longer live with each other. They You can tell them and they can nod their head, but they don't fully grasp why mommy and daddy are not together. And that's when you deal with the children who are trying to figure out, is it my fault that mommy and daddy are not together? Right? The children start blaming themselves. And I think what adults have to understand is, especially when you're talking about small children like a 5-year-old, but even like 10-year-olds, right? You are their world, right? Mommy and daddy are their world, and maybe some bits and pieces of extended family. But they don't have like solid friendships. They have little friends here and there, but those friendships, they're not significant at those ages, right? Mommy and daddy are their world. And so what you're effectively doing is blowing up their world when you split apart. Or let's say if you were never married and all they know is mommy and daddy, and yes, all they've known is that mommy and daddy live in two different places. When mommy attacks daddy or when daddy attacks mommy, you're effectively crushing their world slowly by going after each other or weaponizing the kid against one parent, right? To demonize the other. Like this, you're annihilating their world and you're going to make them suffer because the kids are the ones who ultimately suffer in the long run when the adults play games with their kids. So I think there's so much responsibility, so much power that the adults have that they don't fully understand. And they think that the kids understand what's going on around them when they really don't.
Yeah. You think that most like so like the parents that are out there cheating, that I mean that you're saying that's maybe one of the most damaging things to the kids because it's pure selfishness, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Infidelity is a selfish act for sure. I was reading the Bible earlier this week, and there's a part in Matthew. I can't remember the chapter, but in Matthew, Jesus was talking, and he said he's not advocating for divorce. He's saying divorce is essentially bad, but there's one exception: infidelity, right? And that is how detrimental it is to a family. It is a selfish act when you have children involved. You decide to step out on that relationship to violate a promise that you made, a relational promise that you made to your children's mother by sleeping with someone else. Because why were you sleeping with that other person? And it usually has something to do with how you feel. And it's not about how that benefits anybody else because it never does, right? Which is why you do it in secret, right? Because you know that it's ultimately painful if that person finds out about it. We like to tell ourselves lies so we feel better about the bad things that we do. This is called rationalizing. And so we rationalize our bad behavior so we don't feel guilty for it. But it never fully works because if it worked, then we wouldn't not rationalize it, right? We wouldn't constantly have to do it if it truly worked, and if it was healthy, we wouldn't rationalize it whatsoever. We know it's detrimental. That's why we hide. That's why we tell secrets. That's why we do it in the darkness, right? Because if you brought it to light, it will hurt so many people in your life. And that's why, like, infidelity is so detrimental, but at the same time, so selfish, especially when you have kids involved. I wouldn't be writing this if it was just uh, two adults who wanted to get married, never had kids. If you want to get married and never have kids and you get divorced because you don't like each other anymore, then you know what? You're just hurting each other. The problem is when you bring kids into it, it's not just you two who you're hurting, it's those kids as well. And their entire lives are are dependent on your constant choices, whether they're good choices or bad choices, but they're dependent on what you do. And if you one time make a selfish decision, you can blow up your entire family, but also blow up your child's world because you chose yourself instead of sacrificing your feelings, your emotions, or your quick pleasure for someone who is more important.
What do you want to give like a brief summary of your book? Uh
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the general thesis of the book is the the biggest issues that we face in our society, whether it be homelessness, drug addiction, um, crime, you name it, the really big issues, the ones that are really hard to solve. Whenever I look at those issues and I say, what's the root of it? The root of it tends to come back to family separation. Because even something like homelessness, if you look at San Francisco, well, we say it's a homeless issue, right? Just give them homes and they'll be fine. Well, we know that's not the case because we've seen plenty of situations where you give those same exact people homes, they'd rather be on the streets. Well, why would they rather be on the street? Oh, because they want to take drugs. So why do they want to take drugs? And no one ever answers that question. Why would they want to take drugs? And then you look at them. I've never met a hard drug user who started using hard drugs later in life. They've been using drugs since they were teenagers. Like the vast majority of these people, they've been using drugs most of their life. Now, they may not have been using heroin since, 15, but they were drinking or they were smoking weed, but they gradually increase. They've been taking substances since their teenage years. Well, why would someone take a whole bunch of substances in their teenage years and continue it for decades? Well, it's because they're trying to cope with something. Well, what are they trying to cope with? See, like you keep asking questions and it keeps unraveling. And what often they're trying to cope with is physical abuse, sexual abuse, abandonment, all the above. Um, People who aged out of the foster care system, know where to go, just complete abandonment, have zero support. Um, like these type of issues are so deep and ingrained that you it's near impossible for you to be able to help someone in that situation. Especially if you're talking about someone who's in their 50s and homeless and been doing drugs for 4 decades, right? They've been in pain for decades, and you can't unravel that by giving them an apartment. Like it just does not work. And these people are without hope. I'm not saying that they're hopeless to fix, but these are people who internally feel no hope, right? They're slowly killing themselves. And now, why would they go through all this? And time after time after time, it comes back to a massive event that has happened, or a series of events that have happened when they were children. And the only way they knew how to cope with it and not think about it was by taking substances, by taking drugs. The guy who breaks into your car, do you think he's happy breaking into your car? Do you think this is a satisfied man who is violating your property, breaking into your house, harming people? No, of course not. Well, why is this guy like, how did he get there? Do we think that he woke up at the age of 21 and just became a violent criminal based off of nothing but a single choice? Or was this years of grooming into no one gives a damn about me, so I don't give a damn about anybody? And I have to look out for myself because no one looked out for me when I was being molested, when I was being disregarded, when I was being abused, right? This is a habitual pattern, and all we see is the outcome, but we don't look at everything that led up to that point. And so what I'm trying to say is we as adults are responsible for the detrimental outcomes that we're seeing in our society that we complain about. These people didn't wake up in their 40s homeless and crazy and doing drugs. The guy who's in jail right now didn't wake up at 25 a murderer, right? This is something that was long in the process of the adults who constantly failed them. And I wouldn't even go as far as saying a system, right? Because often we like to arbitrarily say the system failed them, the system let them down. The adults failed them. The adults let them down. And the only system of government that really is important to that child is the family government. And they were brought into this world and let down by one or both of their parents. And so I'm trying to bring it back to the core of the problem, the very root of the problem. And that comes down to individual family decisions. Like I said before, even before that child was born, you made a series of choices to procreate with that man or procreate with that woman, to not get married to that man or to get married to that woman. Like you made a series of choices and brought this precious child into this world, and you treated them terribly. And so now the pain that they feel, they're going to be able to put it out onto the rest of society. They're going to be a drag on society. They're going to be the unpleasant people in our society. And they're not just adults, they're children who have yet healed in adult bodies.
If do you have like any message to like kids out there that are getting to that age where maybe poor choices are going to start being made?
I would say that I think for a lot of them, they are losing hope. And I think, and I read about this in the book, hope is incredibly important. Um, Without hope, what's the point? Without hope, what's the point? Why don't I just shoot up every day? What's the point? Right? I'm not brave enough to slash my throat, so I'll just shoot up every day. As long as I don't have to think about that, right? Because what's the point? Things aren't going to get better. Like that is the mentality of someone who is hopeless. And what I'm trying to say is there is hope. I believe, from a Christian standpoint, I believe there's hope in Christ, right? And there's a gift with Christ. And there is someone who will never let you down through Christ. But let's say you don't want to accept Christ and you don't want to talk about religion, there's still hope because I'm still here and many others are still here despite all the things that happened to us when we were kids, despite the traumatic events that happened to us. There's a chapter in my book talking about foster care, and I have a friend, her name is Carrie Bartholomew, and she was gracious enough to allow me to use her story. Actually, I mostly quote her within that chapter because she was a child who was brought into this world to a mother who hated her, was abusive to her from the very beginning, would insult her, call her names constantly, would physically beat her so much that she would have to hide in her home from her mother. And this is before the age of 5. She was raped at the age of 5 by a friend of her mother's. Her mother was trying to groom her to become a prostitute. And then, before she officially got out of the house and escaped, her stepfather was trying to molest her. So this is a girl who was brought into such a detrimental situation and eventually went into the foster care system by her choice. She ran to the foster care system. She wanted out of that house at the age of 8. And she stayed in the foster care system until she aged out. If you met her, you would have no idea what she went through. She is someone who is hopeful. She is someone that believes in God. And she is someone, despite all of those terrible situations, she sees how God gave her enough of an understanding of what to do to get out. Because imagine an 8-year-old knowing what they need to do to turn themselves over to get out of that house. Right? That's a monumental thing for an 8-year-old to even understand that what they're experiencing is something horrible. And here's what they need to do to leave. And she was able to do that at the age of 8 with no support. And granted, foster care, she has her own stories as far as like what happened in foster care and how much danger she was in. But she never gave the point that foster care was worse than what she experienced at home. And so what I'm saying is, despite everything that she went through, she still had hope. And she, of course, she struggled. There were a lot of things that she was not shown. She was not prepared for when she became an adult. But she is a mother, she is a wife, she is happy, and she's a Christian. And she still sees God, even though all the things that she had went through when she was a child. So I think to myself, if I can come out hopeful and she can come out hopeful, then someone else who's hearing this message who went through something similar um, should have some sort of hope that their childhood traumas do not get to determine their future.
I don't know if this is something you touch on in your book or not, but what if someone loses hope? Do you have any suggestions on how they may get it back?
That's tough. Um, I think the I think sometimes when you lose hope, the best way to get it back is by seeing other people who were going through what you were going through. Um, like I think when you're surrounded by people who all are hopeless, right? I would just imagine like if you're a drug addict, you are the company that you keep. All
Right.
your friends are drug addicts. Everyone is of the same mentality, which is why often when people come out of rehab, they have to move. They have to go somewhere else because that old environment will drag them back down. Not even just to use, but to get them into the mentality that there is no hope. Now let's just get high and forget about everything. And so they have to change their environment. They have to get around people who are doing the thing that they want to do. Maybe right now they don't know how to achieve that, but they need to get around people where they're like, man, that guy, that woman is doing that thing that I want to do. And they came from where I came from. How do I do that? And sometimes you just have to have that spark of curiosity. But I think it's hard to be curious if you don't see a path. And sometimes seeing that person is like that's the end goal, right? Now you just become curious about that path to get to that end goal. So maybe I'm kind of thinking as I'm talking
No, I
to
get
you,
it.
but like I think that changing your environment, changing your circle, if you are hopeless, you're probably surrounded by hopeless people. It reminds me of like the incel community. The incel community thrives off of other men also being hopeless about having sex. And I've heard this multiple times. If there's a guy who starts to gain hope, they get rid of that guy. they say, get out of here. Because there
Right.
is no hope, right? They don't want any part of that. And there's a reason for it. It's because misery loves company. Misery wants no hope whatsoever. And so you quite literally in that circumstance have to leave that circle, right? What they're betting on is that you're afraid of leaving that circle and starting over. But you have to leave that circle if you want to get better. So if the people around you are detrimental to your life, you have to change that circumstance. You have to go elsewhere.
Did you ever get, if it's not too personal, did you ever get close in your journey to giving to losing all hope?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, I have a chapter in the book called "Suicidal, but I'm fine." Um, and my issue with suicidal ideation has been happening since I was, in my single digits. Um, I went to a mental hospital at the age of 8 for expressing that I wanted to die. Um, at the age of 8, you don't fully understand what that means. It's just like everything around you just feels terrible. You just want it to end, right? I think that's the best way of trying to understand the mentality of an 8-year-old. But at no point would you think that most 8-year-olds understand what death actually means, or that maybe they even want to die. It's more of like a cry for help more often than not. I think that was the situation for me. I didn't know what I was going through, and I basically had like a nervous breakdown because of all the things that was happening around me. Um, but after that experience, I just learned to hide how I felt and didn't express myself and became very like emotionless at times. Externally, so my facial expressions became very just mute, but internally, like I was going through a whole lot of stuff, but I didn't feel comfortable telling people. Um, but off and on, I would think about it. And, I read about in the book when I was 21, I had my son and I didn't want to be my father, but I was also I wanted to take a risk and leave my dead end job and try to do something that was beneficial for my son. It's a bit of a long story, but ultimately I decided to leave New Jersey, go to Tennessee after spending about a year like every day raising my son. Became very attached to my son. And it was a massive risk for me to leave, but I felt like it was a risk that was going to work out. I was hopeful that it was going to work. But when I got there, what I thought was going to happen didn't happen. And instead, I became homeless for a little bit. By the grace of God, I had people who were willing to help me for a couple of months before I got on my feet while I was out there. But I'm in this apartment with no furniture, sleeping on an air mattress by myself, all alone. And my son is states away. And I felt like a failure. Like plenty of times I cried myself to sleep because I felt like I was doing the wrong thing. Like it just wasn't working out. Um, I don't know if you're familiar with the band or the group Gnarls Barkley.
Yeah.
So there's a song, um, I believe it's called "But I'm Fine." Um, but the song I've listened to over and over and over, but I never like listened to the words. You know, you listen to something for like a thousand times, but I felt like in like my most hopeless of moments, I was listening to the song, but for the first time I heard it. And he was talking about what I was going through, thinking about suicide. How I try everything but suicide, but it's crossed my mind, is the lyrics. And that's kind of like the chorus. But towards the end he says, "But I'm fine." And I took that as like, one, I'm not alone. Um, so it's comforting knowing you're not alone in those situations. Um, Yeah. I mean, even when I think about it now, it's
No, yeah, I get it.
um but yeah, I think that that was a dark place, and I thank God for opening my ears to hear that message. Um but I know exactly what it feels like to feel hopeless.
We'll change the subject, make it a little lighter on you. Have that I know hopelessness is a horrible feeling. I assume
Yeah.
most people have felt some extent of that at some point in their life. But everyone's end of the world uh, isn't necessarily the same. So
Yeah.
there's varying
Exactly.
degrees on that. Have you ever looked at this from like does this affect every race? Is there certain races that this affects more? Obviously, I assume there are certain reasons for that, but is that something you ever looked into?
Yeah, the um if we're talking about like single parenthood rates, what's interesting is the conversation tends to be about Black Americans, and I understand it because it's disproportionately high, right? The children who were born out of wedlock, essentially. And while it may not be like one to one as far as, yeah, you were born out of wedlock, but maybe you are in an intact home, that kind of situation. But um, I would venture to say that most of those situations where the children are born out of wedlock, it is not a from age 0 to 18, the mother and the father are living in the same home, right? You're more likely to get that circumstance if you are married. And there's various reasons as to why. So disproportionately, it is high for Black Americans. However, what I would contend is that for the majority population, which are white Americans, in totality, there are more white Americans who are experiencing this situation than Black Americans. It's just that it is because it's the majority population, it's spread out. And while I'm talking about single parenthood linked with crime and things like that, a lot of that has to do with location, right? So when we think of where do Black people live, 60, I think it's like 62, 63% of Black Americans live in 10 states, so Illinois, Chicago.
Right,
When we think of, Georgia, Atlanta, right? So we know exactly it's in or in the surrounding urban major cities, urban areas, right? California, Los Angeles, that kind of situation. So if you have a high rate, I would say a high percentage of children who are growing up in single parent homes, and on the extremes, because obviously not every kid who from a single parent home is a criminal and using drugs, but on the extremes they are. The extremes get exaggerated because the people are clustered. And so you are going to see more gang violence because gangs are a result of lost boys who are directionless, who are getting
right,
caught up, right? So the issue gets concentrated in specific areas. And coincidentally, those specific areas tend to be media hubs for those areas, right? So every time we turn on the news, there's some violent crime, we get New York, Chicago, LA,
right,
right? Maybe DC, right? And they tend to be a high concentration of Black Americans. On the disproportionate side, they are criminals, right? On the extremes, they are criminals. And that becomes the thing that is really in our face, right? But do I think that, in rural or even suburban areas in Iowa, that Black people are the majority population committing crimes? or places in New Mexico, Arizona, where majority of the population is Hispanic, right? So obviously it's location oriented. But
Right.
I think for a lot of white Americans, because um, obviously the majority of people who are incarcerated are not black.
Right.
So the majority population is suffering from this, right? It's just that the issue is spread out throughout the country. It's not as concentrated as it is for Black Americans. That's kind of like the unique thing that is happening. But the reason I bring that up is because if we make the focus only about Black Americans and the lack of a united family for Black Americans, we're actually ignoring the pain of every other child, including white children, who are also suffering from family separation, from divorce, from single parenthood, right? From foster care, right? Because there are plenty of white kids who are going through the same thing, who are growing up poor, who are being left behind, who are being ignored, who are suffering, right? So I think, well, not I think, I know the reason why I wrote the book the way that it did, which is apolitical and non-racial, is because the problem is much bigger than one race or two races, but is a cultural issue that spreads beyond the United States, even into places like the United Kingdom. And they're facing much of the same type of problem that we are. They're just behind us. Pew Research shows the United States is number one when it comes to children growing up in homes where there is at least one biological parent who does not live there. So I think it's, if I remember correctly, it's like 23% in the United States. 23% of children in the United States are growing up in a home that's missing one biological parent. And more often than not, they're growing up in a home with the mother, without the father. The United Kingdom is right behind the United States. I think it's about 21%. Right? So they're number two in the world. We're number one, they're number two. And so why is that the case? And there are other Western nations involved as well. But why is that the case? What is going on culturally that is saying that is making this such a prevalent issue? And why aren't we questioning it? And I don't think this is a racist motivation or anything like that. I understand logically why it becomes the talking point for Black Americans, but I think it does a disservice to all children when we just make it about some children, because all children of every race are at the whims of bad parental decisions.
I do think it's fair to say it does seem like the black family has been maybe the first to be attacked and then maybe moved on to the other races. But do you see very much of this in the Asian or Latino communities? Or is it more just like a black and white? I mean, obviously it probably happens to every race, but
Yeah, actually, Hispanics are right behind Black Americans. If I remember correctly, I mean, I think it depends on which one you look at. Single
right,
parenthood rate for Black Americans, some people quote 65%, some people quote upwards of mid 70s. But for Hispanics, they've been under 60% for quite some time. I've seen, I think it was like 55 or 56% of Hispanics in America are growing up in single parent homes, which is a lot. It's a
right,
lot of people. That's a high percentage. And on top of that, there are way more Hispanics in the United States than there are Black Americans, right? But much of the issue is that they live in particular states and they
right.
are also kind of spread out even within those particular states. So they're not necessarily in the urban areas in the same way that Black Americans are. Um, so the problem the problem exists for all races, percentage wise, but in totality, we're looking at a massive, massive problem within this country of the amount of children who are who are being separated from at least one parent, who are growing up in homes, who've always grown up in a home separate from one parent, who are being divided through divorce. And some people blame no fault divorce. Personally, I just blame selfishness.
Right
I
on.
blame parental selfishness for these different choices for parents to choose to break apart and destroy a child's world. Um, so there's a lot that's going on there. But for to answer your question, like Hispanics, yeah, they're right behind Black Americans.
Right on.
Um, yeah,
I guess I'm surprised by that because in my community, it seemed like Hispanics were always very family oriented, where they'd have a few generations living together. So I guess I'm
yeah.
semi surprised by that.
I think
Um,
it's I think it's also I don't know. Actually, do you mind telling me what state you live in?
Iowa.
You live in Iowa. Okay.
Yep.
So I think it's dependent because the states that have the highest Hispanic population tend to be border states.
Right on.
Um, I live in New Jersey, and actually, coincidentally, New Jersey, I think it's ranked number 5 in Hispanic population. Um, I believe it's number 5 or number 6, but we're like the top one that's not a border state.
Right on.
Um,
I'm
uh,
surprised by that too. It doesn't. It seems like Midwest would be more obvious choice, but
no, no, yeah, New Jersey, and I think there's a whole bunch of reasons as to why.
right on.
But yeah, I personally I've lived in New Jersey for decades now, and there are entire towns that are like Hispanic, like Perth Amboy, all Hispanic,
That's
of
crazy.
different flavors of Hispanic. But you go to stores, the signs are in Spanish, and then you go to the next town, and there are none. Like
Jeez,
so,
crazy.
it's like patches of towns that are predominantly Hispanic throughout the
Right,
state,
right on.
um, which is and it's a small state geographically, but it's a very condensed state. It's very multicultural in certain like where I live at my building. It's like the United Nations. Everyone lives here.
Right on.
Um, but yeah, it's a very high concentration of Hispanic Americans that live here. Um, but I just to kind of answer your question, I think if we were to probably look at stats in places like Texas or California, you would probably see what the percentage of incarceration looks like for Hispanics in these particular areas. Famously, we talk about gang violence in LA, but that wasn't just for blacks, that was also for Latinos living in LA. So it's you're going to see the problem in different ways in different parts of the country.
Right,
Um, but I think it's most of these issues aren't always racial. It's sometimes geographical.
right on. I know we're getting long on time, so I'll just kind of ask you like one more question, and that would
Sure.
be like, what's your main message you're trying to get across to the world with your book?
I think the main message I'm trying to get across is that um, the adults of children, the parents, have way more power and responsibility for their children than they realize, and that the need to sacrifice for their children is lifelong, right? At the very least, if I was just put some sort of asterisk, at the very least until they are out of your house,
Right on.
right? But yes, there are ups and downs with every marriage. Um, and I've known plenty of people who've been married for decades, and none of them act like, oh yeah, everything has been perfect our entire time. There are ups and downs with any relationship, right? But the core of it is a friendship and a love with each other. And especially when you have children involved, it is listen, we need to resolve this, not for just us, but for our kids, because our kids are more important to us than what we have going on here. So if having peace in the house means saying, I'm sorry, and you say you're sorry, and we figure out some sort of resolution, that's the best approach because our kids are more important than our egos at this moment. Um, so I think that's the number one thing of realizing is that number one thing I'm trying to convey is that the parents need to realize they have more power than they realize. They have more of an effect than they realize on their kids. And no matter if they make bad decision after bad decision, their children are going to bend over backwards 9 times out of 10 to rationalize your bad decisions. Why? Because every child wants to love their parent. And if your choices are predicated on if your child gives you the thumbs up or thumbs down, most children are not going to tell you no, right? Most children want to people please their parents.
Right.
Every child wants their parent to love them. And they feel like if you put them in an adult position, right? Like that's an unfair position to put a kid in. So the adults have to realize that you can't treat your children like adults and think that they think like you think. You have to realize that the kids are dependent on you, and every decision that you make can be a lifelong impact on that child. And if there's anything I can convey within this book, is that your rationalizations are because you know deep down inside what you're doing is detrimental and wrong. You do not rationalize things that you know are good. So I think that's like the number one thing. It is a mirror to the adults who have kids, so they can see what they're doing and see that you're lying to yourself when you're saying the kids will be fine and kids are adaptable and whatever language you want to use, you are lying to yourself, and you're lying to yourself on behalf of your kids who are not adaptable, right? Your kids are going to suffer in some form or fashion. They're going to suffer. They're going to struggle with something when you decide to blow up the world.
Adam, I appreciate you coming on and talking about your book, The Children We Left Behind, and taking time out of your busy schedule. They can pre-order your book right now on Amazon, right?
Yeah, they can purchase it on Amazon or any book retailer, or they can buy it directly from Wrong Speak by going to by going to www.wrongspeak.net.
All right, we'll put the links in the description too. Is that going to be out, do you know, on Audible by chance?
It will.
A little
We're
later.
working on, yeah, it might be a couple weeks, 2 to 3 weeks after it comes out.
Okay. Kindle first though, right? Kindle you can
Yeah.
order pre-order it right now.
Yeah, it's available on pre-order for Kindle and for the paperback. But the audiobook is coming. It's being like on the last stages of editing, but it is coming.
Right on. We appreciate it again, Adam, and have a good one.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.